Last time, we talked about Congress, Article 1 of the Constitution. Now we're on to Article 2, which creates the executive branch. And when we talk about the executive branch, we're usually talking about the president. What does the president do? Article 1 spells out in detail what kinds of laws Congress can make. Article 2 doesn't do that for the president. The way it works is basically to give the president a couple of different roles. In those different roles, he can exercise different powers. So one thing the president does is to enforce the laws. You could almost think like a sheriff. He does this with the help of other executive officers, members of his cabinet and federal prosecutors and the FBI and most of the government's workers. These are his posse. He can generally control those people as he wants. He can hire them and fire them and tell them what to do. Although for some high-level positions, he can't hire someone without Senate approval. He also appoints federal judges, though here again Senate approval is required. The president also has some power to conduct foreign affairs. He can make treaties with Senate approval, and he can also enter into executive agreements on his own. And the president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He can't declare war. That power is reserved to Congress. But if there is a war, he conducts it. So if you look at this list of powers, you might think the president is secondary to Congress, like Article 2 comes after Article 1. Congress makes laws, then the president enforces them. Congress declares a war, then the president fights it.
Who's got the power? The framers knew this at some point. Everyone wants it. And they were most afraid of men who would become president and then try to behave like a king. This cartoon is not actually a king. It's President Andrew Jackson after he had a fight with Congress. If any one branch tries to get too much power, the framers fixed it so that other branches could bring it into balance.
But as things have worked out, power has shifted away from Congress and towards the president. The basic reason is that Congress has its own separation of powers. 2 houses, 100 senators, hundreds of representatives, and rules like the filibuster that make it hard for even a majority to get much done. The power of the executive branch, by contrast, is concentrated in one person. Just one person makes the decisions, and he can act quickly and decisively. So over time, we've seen the president gain power at the expense of Congress, particularly in times of war. We can start that story with Lincoln. During the Civil War, Lincoln did a bunch of things that might not have been constitutional. He seized ships bound for Confederate ports. The Supreme Court eventually said that was okay. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus. That is, he said that he could arrest people on his own and not have to explain why to a court. The Supreme Court didn't rule on that, though one justice, acting by himself, ordered Lincoln to release a prisoner, and Lincoln refused. Lincoln also tried to prosecute civilians in military commissions rather than federal courts. The Supreme Court said he couldn't do that. And he announced that he was freeing the slaves in Confederate states. The Emancipation Proclamation, one of our most celebrated documents, is an unusual expansion of presidential power, quite possibly not consistent with the Constitution. In defense of these actions, Lincoln made the argument that presidents always make. It's necessary. Surely I'm supposed to do what is necessary to save the country. In his words, are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated? The Supreme Court did tell Lincoln no about his military commissions. But generally, people think of Lincoln as a great president. They accept his aggressive actions to save the nation from disaster. They accept the expanding power of the presidency. 80 years later, Franklin Roosevelt faced another crisis, the Great Depression. To fight that disaster, he expanded the federal government and its reach into the nation's economy, what we call the New Deal.
I am prepared, under my constitutional duty, to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. These measures, or such other measures, as the Congress may build out of its experience and wisdom, I shall seek within my constitutional authority to bring to speedy adoption. But in the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these two courses, in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe.
He did this with the support of Congress, but over the opposition of the Supreme Court, which fought him tooth and nail for several years, until it finally backed down, possibly because he had threatened to add new justices if the old ones didn't agree with him. And then came something even worse: World War II. Roosevelt took more power. He prosecuted some captured Nazi saboteurs in a military commission, and even told the Supreme Court that he would defy an order to send them to federal court instead. He evacuated Japanese Americans from the Pacific coast and detained them in camps. No one said no to him. These policies were generally popular, and they were supported by Congress and the court. Roosevelt was elected 4 times, and he looked a lot like a president for life. He didn't leave office until he died. That's the presidency that gets handed to Harry Truman, Roosevelt's vice president. And Truman continues in the same way. He drops atomic bombs on Japan, ending the war. He sends U.S. troops into Korea without congressional authorization, on the theory that this is a United Nations police action, not an American war. And then, in order to ensure the supply of steel for those U.S. troops, he seizes the steel mills to prevent a strike.
And he wasn't going to let that happen.
If steel production stops, we will have to stop making the shells and bombs that are going directly to our soldiers at the front in Korea.
He gave a very impassioned speech.
The steel companies sue him, and this creates the Youngstown case, which gives us the framework we now use to decide whether the president has gone too far. How should we decide that? The problem the Supreme Court faced was that we do want the president to be able to save the nation in a time of crisis. But we don't want the president to be able to claim there's a crisis when none exists, or exaggerate one and use it as an excuse to take more power. So how can a court decide if a claim of necessity is true or not? The obvious answer is get a second opinion. See what Congress thinks. And that's basically what the court decided. This is Justice Robert Jackson's opinion, and he wasn't writing for a majority of the justices. Nonetheless, later courts have taken the framework he set out as controlling. Jackson says that we can divide presidential action into 3 categories. First, when Congress says yes, the president acts pursuant to an express or implied authorization of Congress. Then his authority is at its maximum. He's the federal sovereign personified. The second kind of situation is when Congress says nothing. Jackson wrote, "When the president acts in absence of either a congressional grant or denial of authority, he can only rely upon his own independent powers, but there is a zone of twilight in which he and Congress may have concurrent authority, or in which its distribution is uncertain." Third, when Congress says no, the president takes measures incompatible with the expressed or implied will of Congress. Here, the president's power is at its lowest ebb. We should be more willing to allow presidential action when Congress approves, Jackson says, less willing when they haven't spoken, and least willing when they oppose it. In Youngstown itself, he decided, Congress was opposed. They'd considered how to handle strikes, and they hadn't given the president the power to seize the mills. So the court ordered him to hand them back, and he obeyed. The Youngstown Framework seems pretty simple in principle. But here are 2 things to think about that complicate it a little bit. First, remember the party system. Whether Congress supports or opposes the president is supposed to be an indicator of whether Congress thinks what the president is doing is an appropriate response to a real emergency. But with the party system, you might not get that. A Congress controlled by the same party might be too willing to grant approval, and one controlled by the other party might be too hesitant. Second, what happens when the president and Congress disagree? Does the president always have to follow the law? So far, the Supreme Court has always said yes. It has never said that the president is allowed to break the law if necessary to save the nation. But presidents have consistently asserted that they are. President Roosevelt's Attorney General said this to the Supreme Court acting as commander-in-chief. In time of war, the president is not bound by the law. And more recently, memos that set out the legal views of the executive branch have said the same thing. If the president in good faith believes some course of action is necessary to save the country, laws cannot stop him. So there are really two questions here. If the president thinks it's necessary, but Congress has said he can't do it, do you want him to do it anyway? Break the law? And second, if he does, do you want courts to say that it's okay? Two different questions, both hard, both worth thinking about. So that's Article 2 of the Constitution, the federal executive. What's up next? Article 3, the federal judiciary. See you next time.